On February 16, 1861, U.S. President-elect Abraham Lincoln meets the girl who inspired his iconic beard. A few weeks before he was elected president in 1860, Abraham Lincoln received a letter from Grace Bedell, an 11-year-old girl from Westfield, New York. In the letter, she urged him to grow a beard. She claimed it would help him get elected since, quote, all the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, end quote. Remember, women did not yet have the right to vote in 1860. Lincoln responded to her in a letter on October 19th, but made no promises. He won the election and started growing the beard soon thereafter. Inauguration Day back then was March 4th, and Lincoln departed Springfield, Illinois by train on February 11th, 1861. He took a circuitous route to Washington, D.C., making numerous stops along the way. 7 of the eventual 11 Confederate states had already seceded from the Union. One of the purposes of Lincoln's meandering journey to Washington was an effort to do whatever he could to try to hold the remaining states together. In Westfield, New York, he told the crowd that he had grown his beard on young Grace Bedell's suggestion and said he would like to see her if she were present. She came forward and the two greeted each other, quote, amid yells of delight from the excited crowd, end quote. In Westfield, a bronze statue commemorating the moment was erected in 1999. Lincoln made a total of 92 stops at various towns and cities over the 13 days of the trip. He didn't give a full-blown speech at every city. At many of the stops, he just gave a quick address from the train or the train platform. The longer speeches mostly came at the places where he stayed overnight. Naturally, not every word of every speech was recorded, but many were printed in newspapers. Lincoln also jotted down notes of what he planned to say at some of the stops. These speeches are, of course, classic Lincoln, which means they are mostly great, because it seems like everything that Lincoln uttered was great. He was frequently asked about the secession crisis at these stops, and he remained, I guess you could say, cagey about it. He didn't want to say much about exactly what he was planning to do. He was rather political in his approach to these tricky questions. Perhaps no American politician has ever been better than Lincoln at maneuvering around a difficult question. He was wise enough not to proclaim that he would go to war if he must to keep the Union together. He tried to keep it positive and made statements indicating that he believed things would work themselves out. Lincoln, of course, didn't want to come out and say directly what his plans might be. Some of that was likely because he hoped that things could be worked out without going to war. Keep in mind that Fort Sumter didn't happen until April, so no shots had been fired yet. There was still some hope that the crisis could be resolved peacefully. Lincoln's voice actually became hoarse from giving so many speeches. No PA systems back then. Also, Lincoln encountered a number of dignitaries along the route, including the poet Walt Whitman, who of course provided some flowing words about the greatness of Lincoln. Tragically, a few years later, Whitman wrote more flowing words about the greatness of Lincoln, under much different circumstances, with the poem, O Captain, My Captain. On his route, Lincoln also met with former U.S. President Millard Fillmore, newspaper icon Horace Greeley, and poet and newspaper editor William Cullen Bryant. When Lincoln arrived in New York City, interestingly, he did what many today would do when they visit New York City. I have only been to New York City a handful of times, and at least in my adult life, during each visit, I've done something similar to what Lincoln did. He saw a show. Not a Broadway musical, though. That was not a thing yet. But it was, I suppose, the closest thing to that at the time. What Lincoln saw was the latest opera by Giuseppe Verdi, Un ballo in maschera, at the Academy of Music in Manhattan. Ironically, the show centers around the 1792 assassination of a world leader, King Gustav III of Sweden, perhaps portending Lincoln's eventual fate. When the performance reached the end of the first act, the cast and audience stood and sang the Star-Spangled Banner in Lincoln's honor. Lincoln then stood, bowed, and thanked them. That had to be a cool moment. I would have loved to have been there. While in the city, Mrs. Lincoln and the Lincoln children visited P.T. Barnum's American Museum. Another interesting event that occurred in New York City was that Lincoln met a 94-year-old man by the name of Joshua Dewey. Dewey had voted in every single presidential election in the history of the United States, going all the way back to George Washington in 1789, when Dewey was just 22 years old. How cool is that? When Lincoln got to Philadelphia, he visited Independence Hall, something Mrs. Lewis and I will be doing in a few weeks. Lincoln made some interesting remarks there about democracy and the foundation of the nation, which, even to him, had happened a long time ago. Something like 77 years ago, I guess. Well, not exactly. It would technically be 75 years ago. Anyway, outside Independence Hall, Lincoln raised a brand new American flag. It was a 34-star flag because Kansas had been admitted to the Union just a few weeks earlier. There had been some rumors of plots against Lincoln as he traveled. Keep in mind that he would be crossing into slave territory once he got to Maryland. Lincoln was not exactly popular in Maryland, having received a mere 2,300 votes statewide, just 2.5%, good enough for a fourth-place finish. Lincoln received word from William Seward, who would soon become his Secretary of State, that there was some danger ahead, perhaps a plot against his life. Allan Pinkerton of the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency had been hired by railroad officials to provide security for the president-elect on his journey. Pinkerton was convinced of a scheme to ambush Lincoln between two Baltimore railroad stations. After all the fanfare of the journey up to that point, and with Pinkerton accompanying him, Lincoln secretly slipped into and out of Baltimore, and then quietly traveled on to Washington, D.C. The press ridiculed Lincoln for what it perceived as overcautiousness, and speculated that he might be another weak commander-in-chief like recent presidents Pierce and Buchanan. They obviously could not have been more wrong. In fact, the greatest commander-in-chief in the nation's history had just entered the city. Sadly, just over 4 years later, Lincoln's casket took nearly the same route in the other direction. That funeral train made some of the very same stops on its way from Washington, D.C. back to Lincoln's final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1848, in Paris, Polish-born composer Frédéric Chopin gives his final public performance. In 1894, gunslinger John Wesley Hardin is pardoned by Texas's governor after spending 15 years in prison. In 1923, English archaeologist Howard Carter opens the tomb of Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. In 1945, in World War II, U.S. forces regained control of the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. In 1968, in the town of Haleyville, Alabama, the first ever 911 emergency call is placed in the U.S. In 1984, in Sarajevo, Bill Johnson becomes the first American to win Olympic gold in downhill skiing. In 2024, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, a critic of Vladimir Putin, dies in prison at age 47. And now, it's time for our Today in History quiz. When did the United States begin its Voice of America radio broadcasts? 1939, 1942, 1945, or 1948? Think you know the answer? Drop your guesses in the comments below. Find out if you're right tomorrow on Today in History.